Shalom, shalom. I'm Brad Scott, and I'm with the Wild Branch Ministry, and this is Sons of God, Giants in the New World Order, in which we hopefully are in the middle of the process of drawing all these things together. Hopefully I can prove my position rather than just spending the whole time disproving somebody else's, and I'm doing the very best I can to, not do that, so bear with me if I slip once in a while. But we are talking about a subject that is actually part of this program, which is called God is Smarter Than We Are, because I think this is something I believe that our youth need to understand for just such a time as this. Because as I travel, not just in the United States, but having the wonderful opportunity to be able to travel places in the world that I would have never guessed I would have ever been in. If you would have asked me 40 years ago, oh my goodness, it's been a long time. Back in the early 70s and the 70s and 71s and 72s, I made my living playing in rock bands. That's what I did. And I opened for big bands that, if you're 50 years old and older, you would know who they are, but not anymore. But so I spent my life in a world and an atmosphere that was absorbed with all the good and the bad things that go along with that. I'm not here to pour my guts out to you right now, okay? But all the things concerned about that, I was involved in. If you'd have walked up to me in 1972 or something and said, do you know that within the next 20, 30 years, you're going to be teaching ancient Hebrew in China? I'd have gone, well, what are you smoking, man? I mean, that's how I would have reacted. I am spilling my guts. Okay, that's how I would have reacted if you'd have told me that. I'd have never guessed. And one of the reasons why I talk about that now and then, out on the road and so forth, is to let you know, and especially if you are a young person right now, if you're in this next generation right now and you're watching this program, and I hope you are, it's for people of your age, that you'll know that you know that you know. Something that Winston Churchill said as well. Never, ever, ever give up. You have no idea. You may think things are dark and cloudy and depressing and so forth, and you may not. You may be thinking to yourself, "My goodness, this terrible world I live in with all this stuff I'm bombarded with from the religious side of things. That Yeshua's coming every 5 minutes, and the world's going to end, and comets are going to crash and blow up the earth, and spaceships are going to come with aliens, and they're going to stick needles in us." If you're just bombarded with all that kind of stuff. And the world you just don't see a future. Please understand that never ever give up on what you want to do. If whatever you want to pursue in your life, please right now pursue it with everything that you have, everything that's within you, and whatever it is that you want to do, given that it's moral and so forth, do it with all your might and be the most righteous person doing that. That's the object, because that's what we need in this world. And so as I travel around the world, that's what I hear from young people, that they're losing their hope. There's things that they wanted to do, and they get all depressed because, quite frankly, my friends, those of us who are, older and so forth, we talk a lot about, when heaven, when Yeshua gets here, things are going to be so much better. And is that true? Oh, absolutely. Do not get me wrong. Obviously, the kingdom of heaven, as realized, and we've all traditionally thought, is something we definitely look forward to. And that's going to be our hope, and that's going to be exciting, and it's going to be pure, and it's going to be righteous, and no more tears, and no more wars, and no more abortions, and family separations, and hating each other, and shooting each other, and getting no more of that stuff. And we all look forward to that. So that's an absolute truth. But I'm just trying to say, I guess, that as adults, we need to be very careful that someone who's 14 or 15 years old right now, they haven't experienced, they don't understand that. They're thinking, I want to have a family. I want to have a husband, or I want to have a wife, and I want to raise a family, and I want to have children. There's other things that I want to do. I want to experience some of these things in life. So they're not thinking that same way as that we are. And then when we constantly pummel them with the idea, it doesn't matter, your show's coming next week, get your guns, we're going to blow everybody, whatever. That's what's turning our young people into a lack of hope, and just nothing but despair in their life, and they see no future. And then they end up rejecting what we're saying and going out and do whatever they want to do, and you know the results of all those things. And so I want to teach the youth that we are not powerless individuals. We are not wandering around this world just subject to the whims of demons and fallen and things like that. We have a responsibility, we have accountability, and if we are in Him and we are following Him, we have the ability to tread on whatever it is anyway. So we're not out there helpless and defenseless in the world. And that even though the Bible says we fight not against, we don't battle against flesh and blood, the reality is these fallen angels, these demonic things that are going on, operate through. That's how they do that. That's what, to me, the whole concept of demons and things going on in our world is messing with us, messing with our minds. And it's expressed through the evil that people do. In reality, it's not, because I'm going to mention his name later, it's not George Soros. That's not, the flesh and blood Rockefellers or whatever, that's not our enemy. And it is true that it's those that are behind the people. That is absolutely true. But my focus on this is that these things are sent into the world. They're in this world to influence, to drive people to do things, to direct things and so forth. And that's what they're here for, that they're not mating and having sexual relations with human beings and producing these things. That's the only thing that I don't agree with. So I just want to make sure everybody didn't get me wrong in this. And so the influence starts with the model, the words spoken, and the desires and will of what's behind all this, which we were reading in Isaiah chapter 14 the last time we were together. And that is, He's always going to be the one that thinks and teaches us that we don't need a God. We can disconnect ourselves from Him, and that we can do these things. We can express power and greed, and we can have all this stuff, and we don't need Him. So the idea is to remove us from the authority of the Creator, Yod He Vav He, which is expressed in the word Shem, as I said earlier, or name, source of authority, so on and so forth. So the idea is to take us away from it. We were talking about the relationship between mighty ones and princes and rulers and kings of the earth with respect to these dynasties and these bloodlines of these men. And so the next passage I want to quote is in Isaiah chapter 24, verse 21, which says, "And it shall come to pass in that day that Yahweh, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, shall punish the host of the high ones that are on high, and the kings of the earth upon the earth." Now, once again, that phrase "upon the earth" in Isaiah chapter 24, verse 21, which you just read, is expressed as face of the earth, and Bereshit chapter 6, which we were reading, that they were upon the face of the earth and so forth. Same phrase used there. Continuing on, we go into the book of Revelation now, these kings of the earth, these mighty ones. In Revelation 6, verse 15, it says, and I quote, "And the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the rich men, and the chief captains, and the mighty men," Gibor, same word used in Genesis, "and every bondman and every free man hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains." Now, here we have this description. By the way, the phrase "kings of the earth" appears exactly 14 times in the book of Revelation. This phrase, "kings of the earth," is all over the book of Daniel. And most of us understand that when we go read the book of Revelation, we get an understanding of the terminology primarily from Daniel. Also in Ezekiel and Zechariah and so on and so forth, but the prophets we define the terms that are used from the prophets, but one of the primary ones is the book of Daniel, as most of you well know. And these kings of the earth show up there, and then they are repeated again over and over and over, exactly 14 times in the book of Revelation. So we have these kings of the earth, these mighty men and so forth, that implies that they're the ones doing the ruling, they're the ones making the decision, they're the ones killing and murdering, as I talked about before. But once again, it's also in the verse that here's what they're going to be doing in the end times. Oh, they may be doing that now. They may be ruling and suppressing the people and slaughtering and murdering everything in their way. But in the end, they're going to be cowering in the dens. And they're going to be cowering behind things. And of course, eventually, if you will, they're going to be taken out. That's what the scriptures promises us. In Revelation chapter 17, verses 1 and 2, it continues on and says, there came out of one of the 7 angels which had the 7 vials and talked with me, saying, come hither. I will show you the judgment of the great whore that sits upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have made drunk with the wine of her fornication. Once again, there's a description here, once again, of this entity, this great, now this is going to be something that when it talks about committing fornication with them, the assumption is that they're having sexual relations with this great whore. But as we go back and read of these people that are going to align themselves with her and so forth, they have taken upon her customs and her laws, and she rules them and they follow them. The idea is also in one of the assemblies in the book of Revelation. Let's read that as well. In the book of Revelation, which we were just reading from, in the assemblies in which these letters are written to, as you well know, there is a passage dealing with in Thyatira. Let me get to Thyatira here. Thyatira, it says, and unto the messenger. Now, there's another big discussion there. Messenger, is that a winged creature? Or is that a person that represents Thyatira in each one of these assemblies? Some people believe that there is actually writing to the elders of each one of those congregations. The reason why there's different opinions of that is because, once again, this word that's translated from Hebrew as angel and into the Greek angel, angelos and so forth, does not necessarily mean some sort of winged creature. It says, these things saith the Son of God, who hath eyes like unto a flame of fire, and his feet are like fine brass. I know your works and charity and service, and your faith and your patience, and your works, and the last to be more than the first. Notwithstanding, I have a few things against you, because you suffereth that woman Jezebel, which calls herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants to commit fornication and to eat things sacrificed unto idols. Now, clearly, the context of this fornication is that she's not actually mating with these people, but it's through the teachings of these organizations. It's through the things that they say, which comes from where? In the beginning hath God said words, seducing, deceiving people with enticing words, nasha, which causes them to commit fornication. We're not talking about physically having sexual relations, but rather that word is used in context with aligning with someone. You become one with them. It's just the analogy sometimes is used is when a man goes into a harlot or so forth, and becomes one with them. But the idea is talking about a group of people aligning with someone because of teaching and so on and so forth. So it's not talking about actually having sexual relations. I want you to remember that there are ancient bloodlines and modern bloodlines that are maintaining the balance of power here. Because we've all, remember, again, these are noble ones. We already talked about the fact that they are men of renown. Don't forget that the word renown there is Shem. Because one of the passages, when we go back in Genesis chapter 6, is that they are not only mighty ones, but they are renowned, men of renown, which comes forth from Shem, which is where we get the idea of nobility and so forth, is through the Latin nobilitas, which is from eugenis in the Greek, which is well known or famous. So that's Shem. Once again, I want to remind you that literally men of renown is men of a name. Now, what does that mean? What is it talking about? It's talking about the fact that they're following their authority now. That's source of. Remember, Shem means the source. So they don't want the creator of the universe. They don't want Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh to be the source of their understanding of where things come from and how to behave and what your morals and ethics are. They want to disconnect from that. They want to break their bands asunder, cast their cords from us, and they want to follow under another authority, another name, so they are men of renown, and that is associated with the mighty ones. As a little bit later here, we'll get to Gibor in just a few minutes. But I wanted to give you a modern expression. Well, actually, it's not a modern expression. It's something that's been there from the very beginning. There have been dynasties and men of ruling bloodlines and so forth from the very beginning. And many of these dynasties and bloodlines still exist today. As a matter of fact, most of them on this list exist today. And I just wanted to give you a few examples of some of these bloodlines. Some of these names, as we go through this list very quickly, I'm going to go ahead and name them, and then we'll come back and talk about a few, will be very familiar to you, and we will come back and talk about them along the way. First, we have the Astor bloodline. We have the Collins bloodline. These are, if you search manufacturing and so forth, you'll see where these things come from. The DuPont bloodline would be one we all recognize, paint and so forth. The Freeman bloodline, the Kennedy bloodline, the Lee bloodline, the Onassis bloodline. Notice that when John F. Kennedy was shot and killed, that someone was specifically chosen to maintain the bloodline. So Jackie Kennedy married into the Onassis bloodline, because you've got to maintain the bloodlines. The Reynolds bloodline, the Rockefeller bloodline, the Rothschild bloodline, these are very familiar. The Van Duyn bloodline, and there's, of course, British royal lines from the House of Wessex and Windsor and so forth. Prince Charles and things like that come from these lines. But there's other dynasties you may not be aware of that are still dominant in the world today. The Swaziland dynasties, the Roman, Egyptian, Greek dynasties, particularly the Chinese dynasty. Some of the most bloodthirsty murderers in the world were women leaders in the various Chinese dynasties over time. And of course, you have the Korean dynasties, the Irish and the Gaelic bloodlines, the Middle East and Persian ones, the Islam, Fethullah Gulen, and so forth, the dynasties, powerful bloodlines as well. And finally, the Merovingian, or Merovingian, depending upon how you want to pronounce it, the Merovingian European royal bloodlines and families. Now, the Merovingian, that's the way I pronounce it, not sure exactly, is a very familiar bloodline. If you really pay attention to sometimes when you're watching movies that have this as a context whatsoever, you'll notice that the Merovingian will pop up. As a matter of fact, if you get an opportunity to, and you listen or watch some old James Bond movies, I wish I could name them for you right now, but I know all the James Bond movies because I'm a big James Bond fan, but I just can't remember which one it's in. There are a handful, particularly in the beginning, Dr. No, From Russia with Love, and Goldfinger and all that, where this Merovingian is mentioned in the James Bond movies, because this is a very well-known line of rulers up in the world and so forth, that through their bloodlines, through choosing particular people within that bloodline. Why? Because they've been deceived. Remember, Paul writing to Timothy says, they're deceiving you, having been deceived. They're deceived, as well as a lot of other people, into thinking that where the power and where the intelligent people come from and the worthy people are actually through man's blood. And once again, man's blood is the problem, not the solution. And so they're maintaining these things down from one generation to the next. And so, therefore, they've been duped into thinking that they've got to marry into these bloodlines in order to pass along the real, truly noble people from one generation to the next. So they're deceived into thinking that it's a matter of man's blood. And so that's why they pass these things down from one generation to the next. Remember when the King of England and so forth married a commoner back about 7 years ago. Boy, was that a scandal throughout all the world when a royal king from the British Wessex House of Windsor, I can't remember which one it's from, so forth, married a commoner. Oh, all HE double toothpicks broke loose along the world because you just don't do that. You don't marry a peon. You don't marry a low-life servant, one that, got tanned from working all day long and so forth. And so this thing passes down to other very well-known organizations as well. For instance, you may be familiar with other powerful dynasties and bloodlines. For example, the Grand Master Masons. These are examples that represent these things. Grand Master Masons, Blue Bloods, as we mentioned earlier, Rothschilds, Rockefellers, Fords, Bilderbergers, Illuminati. This is how they express themselves. Eastern Star, Royal Knighthood Orders, Opus Dei, George Soros, Club of Rome, the intellectual elite. These are really all terms that it is fundamentally describing the same people throughout the earth. These are the ones that are in control of things. And once again, let's just take the Bilderbergers, for example. The Bilderbergers actually refers to the place, not necessarily a line of people, even though it does. The place, the Bilderbergers is not the problem. It's where they met, okay? And so they called everybody who met at this hotel and whatever, the Bilderbergers and so forth. And so they had these annual meetings, and these things used to be held in private. Nobody knew about these things. There were secret organizations that are going on all over the place, the Bohemian Gardens and all those kind of things. Some of you know what I'm talking about. This used to be, nobody knew anything about this. They were hush-hush things that were talked about in secret corners and with great men sitting in hotels, drinking brandy snifters and so forth and things like that, and smoking big stogies and talking about these things. But then when the peons began to catch on, they began to realize that we need to shift our MO. We need to go back to the pattern from the very beginning, and that is to just now have everything out in the open. And so now every year, on various programs, you can see them, cameramen and journalists out there taking photos. As a matter of fact, they're even allowed into the meetings, because I'm going to quote from some of the people who go to these meetings. So now we're allowed into the meetings. Reporters are allowed to come there. Journalists and photographers can stand outside there and see all the limousines pull up to the hotel and all these big and powerful guys get out. So once again, the idea is to mix it all together. So we got a whole bunch of guys with red hats and black shirts, and you really can't tell who is who. And that's the modus operandi of the enemy, is to put it all out there for everybody to see. And so we see this thing happening right in front of our very eyes for everybody to see. Now, continuing on, in Bereshit chapter 6, verse 3, now that we've talked about the possibilities of who the sons of God are, remember there's 3 or 4 different possibilities. I hope at least at this point, have given you some reasonable evidence of why I believe that these are sons of mighty ones. They're descendants that came forth from them that passed these things down primarily through particular chosen bloodlines and so forth. And that we've read about who these guys were from various passages and so forth. Now we're going to get a little bit more information in Genesis chapter 6, verse 3 and 4. Genesis chapter 6, verse 3 says, and I quote, and Yahweh said, my spirit shall not always strive with who? With man. For he that is also is flesh, yet his day shall be 120 years. 120 years. Now, he refers to Noah here. But there's a couple of things I want to highlight. One I've already done. Who's he striving with? Man. Now, I know you've probably heard this before, but it needs to be brought out anyway. But one of the problems I have with this chapter is the same thing, or this section of Scripture is the same thing that a lot of other people who agree with me also have with this one. So you've probably heard this before, but all the evidence needs to be laid out on the table, in my opinion. That is that if these entities, these fallen angels come down and cause all this to happen, why isn't our Father, why isn't the Spirit of God striving with them? Why isn't he not holding them accountable? but rather striving with man. Once again, this is one of the 73 occurrences of the same characters over and over and over in Genesis chapter 1, verses 6 through chapter 6, verse 6. And so he's striving with man. But he also mentions the Noah Haftorah, because part of Genesis chapter 6 is going to start the second Torah portion, Noah. It's going to be part of the second Torah portion in our weekly readings, in which the Haftorah portion is Isaiah chapter 54. Now, I'll remind you, and we're probably going to bring this up again later, that when we read the first Torah portion, we read about nothing but men and daughters and humans and et cetera, et cetera. Then when we read the second Torah portion, we have a flood, and what's perishing? The men, the people, because he chooses 2 and 7 and so forth from the humans. So the humans that go on there are Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives, which means what? The ones that were left behind were also humans. It's just that they're ones that didn't get on the ark. And then we talk about all the animals and so forth. So once again, when you read the Noah Torah portion, there's no mention anywhere in there of these fallen angels perishing in the flood. What's constantly perishing? Human beings, daughters, sons, men's, males, females, etc.
Want more Brad Scott? Get his brand new teaching, In My Flesh, an 8-disc set, now available at HebraicRootsNetwork.com.
So in the Torah portion, the first Torah portion, no mention of these characters, and no mention of these characters in the Haftorah portion. Then when we get to the second Torah portion, no mention of these characters, and as we're about to read, no mention in the Haftorah portion. And remember, we also, in the past episodes, went into the passages in the New Testament that talk about the days of Noah, and no characters like this. And though we seem to be completely dealing with men, evil men, but nonetheless men. So in the equivalent Haftorah portion of the Noach is generally speaking in the first 10 verses in Isaiah chapter 54. And I want to read some of those once again. Sing, O barren, you didst not bear, bring forth into singing and cry aloud, you who did not travail with child, for more are the children of the desolate than the children of the married wife, saith Yahweh. Enlarge the place of your tent. Enlarge is, remember, Japheth, okay? Enlarge the place of your tent. Let them stretch forth the curtains of your habitation. Spare not, lengthen your cords, strengthen your stakes. For you shall break forth on the right hand and on the left, and your seed shall inherit the Gentiles and make the desolate cities to be inhabited. Fear not, for you shall not be ashamed, neither be confounded, for you shall not put to shame. You shall forget the shame of your youth and not remember the reproach of your widowhood anymore. And then it goes down on the rest of it and talks about women and wives and people and so on and so forth. So I kind of rushed over that, but the bottom line once again is no mention of, if these things are so incredibly important to understand for just such a time as this, then where are these in the first 2 Torah portions in particular, and the mentions of the days of Noah in the latter years as well? So we have our Father, the Spirit of our God, striving with men, and his day shall be 120 years. Why? Because we're dealing with men. And of course, he knows a flood is coming, and so that's, people have understood how long it's going to take to make the ark and blah, 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 so forth, because what's going to perish in the flood is going to be men. That's why until that ark is completed and the rains come, he's going to strive with men until then. Now, let's go on to Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. Here's where the famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, Nephilim, are going to come into view, is in Bereshit chapter 6, verse 4. So let's read that. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, literally the man there, and they bore children to them, the same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. Okay, there's several things going on here, so we're probably going to spend at least the next couple programs, just on the words and the terminology that's used here. The first thing I want to highlight is that we said this earlier, that what appears to be clearly in the Hebrew, but revealed in the English as well, is that these Nephilim, these giants, we're going to break down here pretty soon, that are in the earth, were not the result of this that took place in Genesis chapter 6, verse 2, because they were already there before the sons of God came into the daughters of men. So there were giants, which I believe literally were giants, okay, big, tall. I mean, I do believe that it's referring to that, but it's also secondary, from a secondary point of view, it's going to speak of powerful men, giants in the world. He's a giant in his industry. We're going to see uses of that. That's where that idea comes from, is comparing it to a literal tall person as to a very powerful individual. But we'll talk about that a little later. So there were Nephilim in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in, the daughters of men. So I just wanted to highlight that thing first, because the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about this phrase, Nephilim, that's translated as giants in this passage. It comes from the word Han Nephilim. Han Nephilim. That's actually the word that's used there. Han Nephilim. It comes from the root Nun Pe Lamed. Nun Pe Lamed. It's here in its pictographic form, and it's the Hebrew that you're used to. It's from the root Nafal, Nun Pe Lamed, which literally means to fall, to command, to lead or control life. It's translated as fallen ones, but pictographically it means to command. That comes from the Pe. To lead, that comes from the Lamed, and life, which comes from the Nu. To command or to lead or control life. That's what a shepherd does. It's translated in your Bible as fall, fallen, fail, perish, cast down, overthrow. Now that's all the words that it's translated from. Actually, technically, this particular form that's used here is only used one other time in the same form in Numbers chapter 13, verse 33. Let me read that to you very quickly. Numbers chapter 13, verse 33 is the only time we have it in various other forms, but if we're going to be consistent with the exact use of it in another place, here's where it is. Numbers chapter 13, verse 13, or verse 33. This is, of course, the context. Spies are going into the land. 10 are going to come back with an evil report. 2 are going to have a good report. You know the whole story. And so they're going to give you a description of what they see with their eyes when they go into the land. And in verse 33, it says, "And we saw giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, which are in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight." Now, I just want to highlight that the only other occurrence of this word in this form in particular is dealing with real people, children of Anak, Anakim, and so forth. We're going to talk about those words later. And so when they went into the land, what they saw with their eyes was something very intimidating. And so because it was very intimidating, most of them came back with an evil report, and they didn't trust our Father in his promises, and so they were intimidated, and you know the whole story from that point forward. And so this is the only other use. Now, going back to our word here, Nun Pe Lamed is a word that means to lead or control life, to command as to lead and control life. And that's really what physical giants do, as later on we'll probably talk about. Goliath was one of these as well. He was a real person, so forth, given a genealogy, where he came from and so forth. But the idea literally in its verbal form is a fallen one. So literally, this word means in Hebrew a fallen one. It's only because of the Septuagint that we're going to get the modern idea of the word giant. It's because of the Septuagint. In the Hebrew, and that's why several translations, Hebraic or Jewish commentators and translations do not use the word giants. They use the word fallen one, because that's literally what the word means. We only get the word giants from gigantes, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. Then when it goes to the Septuagint, all of a sudden it shifts the idea of it being a fallen one to now a giant. That comes from going through the Greek and so forth. And so, but the idea is to control life. So it has various meanings. As I said earlier, let me give an example of a fallen one. We use the idea to express something that's large, actually large. And so we address them as one that is fallen. For example, when you go to cut something down, we don't use the phrase, and he felled a bush. And the man went out and felled a shrub. So we don't use that of these little things sticking out of the ground, but we use the phrase to describe large trees. He felled a tree, for example, because it's used to express the idea of something big coming down. As a matter of fact, the bigger they are, you know how the rest of it goes. That's the reason why we use that phrase, is because it expresses something powerful, not necessarily even a tall person. It doesn't have to be a tall person. It is also used, and we're going to go some of the uses here, to describe something that's very powerful, something, like I said, someone who's a CEO of a particular large industry. We call him a giant. Some people see them as giants in their field, not meaning they were tall people. But as far as writers go, Truman Capote was a giant in his field. Truman Capote was hardly a tall person, okay? But that's the way we use the word. So the word gigantes, once again, comes from the Septuagint. In the Septuagint, this is where we see the word gigantes. This is where we get giants from. It comes from the root gigas, Gigas, which eventually gets into our English word giants. So we have gigantes, comes from the root gigas, which ends up in the English as giants. It's only used in the Septuagint. That's the only time. This word does not appear in the New Testament. And when we break down gigas, we also get ge, which is a gamma and an eta and so forth. And the combination of ge, which is the Hebrew word for earth, or the Greek word for earth, it's not a homosexual. It's just pronounced that way. And gaio. Gaio is came from. So when we put this gigas, which eventually ends up as gigantes and eventually ends up as giants, when we break it down, it's those born or coming forth from the earth. There are, of all the occurrences, there's 33 total occurrences. Every time you read this word, it's speaking of large men or warriors. Every occurrence of the 33 occurrences of this word is always large men or warriors, in which come forth from primarily four Hebrew words. Nephilim is one. Gibor, which is going to be used in Genesis chapter 6 as well. Anach and Raphai and Rapha and so forth. It comes forth from these Hebrew words. This is when you read the JPS, the Hertz, the Stone Kamash, and the Etz Chaim, these commentaries, they're not called giants. They use the Hebrew word Nephilim. In the Miam Loez commentary, they're called titans or mighty ones who ever were. And once again, a simple look at Goliath, Goliath, he was tall and he was defiant to God. And so the image we get when David goes out to meet Goliath in the field, we have a word that means Goliath. It ends up Goliath. Gal. And I've talked in the past many times about this word, words that have a G and an L in them. They have something to do with making a circuit to go round something, G's and L's. This happens to be part of the root of Goliath, relating to something that means something cyclical, okay? Now, the reason why, now you remember that Goliath was from Goth, okay? So it's Goliath Goth. Goliath Goth. Goliath from Goth. That ought to sound familiar because remember, and I'm not going to go to the whole details of this, of course, but David goes out and cuts off the head of this giant called Goliath from Goth, okay? And so it's not a coincidence that he takes off his head, so forth, because the Hebrew root for head or skull also has the G and the L in it. Why? Because a skull is something round. So something round, something cyclical, and something is going to have something to do with gimels and lameds in Hebrew, G's and L's. It's quite possible that literally there's going to be a time when Yeshua was going to crush the head of the serpent, as he's revealed, because Goliath from Gath could become Golgotha, the place of the skull where he was crucified. And it could be that literally below him is a representation of the skull and so forth. And when he hung on that tree, that's what finally destroyed the works of the devil. Remember in 1 John chapter 2, we were told that Yeshua came to destroy the works of the devil. So here he hangs on a tree in a place called Golgotha, what has to do with giants and skulls and so forth, Goliath, and crushing the head of the serpent and so forth, because it was from that point forward he destroyed his works, because that was the prophecy that he would do that. And there's a whole lot more to be understood by that, but I thought I would throw that in. These things seem to be related, so forth. And I did this back, if you remember, back in the Ezekiel's Wheel and those series in which we dealt with things that work in cycles and so on and so forth. So continuing on, we read this earlier, but I want to quote the verse again because this contains this word gigantes. So how is gigantes used? Because it's translated as giants. Let's read Isaiah chapter 14, verse 9 again. It says, hell from beneath is moved for you to meet you at your coming. It stirs up the dead for you, even all the chief ones of the earth. Gigantes, translated as chief ones. Remember, this is related to the kings of the nations and those who are raising up the thrones of the kings of the nations. All these characters are expressed in a multitude of ways. Mighty ones, kings of the earth, chief ones, rulers, setting themselves against Yahweh and his anointed, throwing off the bands, cutting the cords from them, having nothing to do with him. They want to rule. They're the ones that want to destroy and so forth. And that's how the word is used. Let's give another example in Isaiah chapter 49, verses 24 through 25. It says, and I quote, shall the prey be taken from the mighty, gigantes, gibor, in Hebrew, or the lawful captive delivered? But thus saith Yahweh, even the captives of the mighty, gigantes, shall be taken away, and the prey of the terrible shall be delivered. For I will contend with him that contendeth with you, and I will save your children. So these are just some examples, and I believe we're going to read a couple more, of where the word gigantes is referring to people, mighty people, not just ordinary people running around and so forth, but mighty ones who are going to produce mighty ones through dynasties and bloodlines, so they would be called the sons of the mighty ones. And here's what they produce is these mighty men. And another example, Ezekiel chapter 32, verse 27. Says, and I quote, and they shall not lie with the mighty, there's gigantes again, that are fallen of the uncircumcised. You notice the use of the words nafal, that are fallen of the uncircumcised, which are gone down to hell with their weapons of war. They have laid their swords under their heads, but their iniquity shall be upon their bones, that they were the terror of the Gabor, the mighty, in the land of the living. In other words, they're born from the earth, just like all the rest of us are. Gigantes, born, came forth from the earth. That's how it's used of these characters. It goes on in Ezekiel, and it says, and I quote, they are laid with the giants that fell of old. This is from the Septuagint. I'm reading it from exact same passages. I'm reading it from the Septuagint now. And they are laid with the giants that fell of old, because that's not what it says. It says the mighty ones in your Hebrew text, but in the Greek it says, and they're laid with the giants that fell of old, who went down to hell with their weapons of war, and they laid their sword under their heads, but their iniquities were upon their bones, because they terrified all men during their life. These are mighty people who are terrifying and take over and take control of people upon the earth. Even, now I said I wasn't going to do this, but I'll just do it one time. I'm going to quote from an extra biblical book. And I just want to give you the fact that their insight into some of these things as well, because the extra biblical quotations of these characters are not limited just to the book of Enoch, but they're quoted in other places as well. And once again, at the end of this series, we will address the book of Enoch and the two passages in particular that's in the book of Jude and in the book of 1 Peter. The book of Wisdom, 14 verse 6 says, why in the beginning, it's just typical King James English, while the proud giants were perishing, the hope of the world took refuge on a raft and steered by your hand, preserved the germ of a new generation for the ages to come. Once again, I want you to compare that to Psalm chapter 82, verse 1 through 6, in which these characters apparently are going to, when the end comes, they're going to perish. They're going to die like men. Now, in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, we were reading about the giants. We talked about the Nephilim and the various uses of that in Scripture. And then we compared it by going back to the Greek word gigantes, which is where we get the giants part from, and the uses of that all throughout the Old Testament, because that word is not used in the New Testament. In the New Testament, it doesn't use the word gigantes in the Greek. But the same words that are used of these giants and these sons of God are used in the New Testament, primarily as chief ones and rulers and princes and kings of the earth, and so forth, as we have read earlier. So now it also says that they bore children to them, and the same were mighty men. The same were mighty men. I want you to see that once again. So now we're going to talk about the word mighty men. Mighty men in Hebrew comes from the root, and this is the way it's expressed there, hag-gib-borim. Hag-gib-borim. It comes from the root gimel bet resh, which is, in its call stem would be gavar. Gavar. Gimel bet resh. Literally, pictographically, this is a phrase that means the head of the house. It's a picture of the head of the house, a man lifting up something mature. It's the powerful one of the house. And it's expressed also by the idea of lifting something up. This is the man of the house. And it's translated in your Bible, not just as mighty men, but great strength, prevail, Lord. And there's even an occasion in the feminine in which it's translated as a queen. So, Gibor. El Gibor, mighty God. For example, that would be mighty God. That's one of the phrases used in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. The mighty God. El Gibor. So it's something very strong, but once again, it's used of men throughout Scripture. The same is true in the context of Genesis chapter 6 and the other uses as well. And so, for example, the very first occurrence, generally speaking, is going to help us understand, especially the verbal form of this. Mighty men is the noun for it. As a matter of fact, mighty here is used as an adjective here. But someone who is mighty would be in its noun form, but it's going to have a verbal background to it, because that's the way the words work. Very first occurrence is in Genesis chapter 7, verse 19. It's the flood, and it says, and the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth. All the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. And so the very first occurrence is actually translated as the English word to prevail over something. It's used in a verbal form. To have strength and power over someone is how it's actually used in Scripture. To give you another example, in Genesis chapter 10, verses 8 and 9, it says, and Cush begot Nimrod. Remember, this is the character who began to be something in the earth. Cush begot Nimrod. He began, that's Halal, to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before Yahweh. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before Yahweh. So one of the very first occurrences of this word that's describing these men of renown, these giants, these results, and so forth. of what happens in the opening chapters of Genesis is speaking of men. Nimrod was a character in history. He's the one who became a mighty hunter before God, and he's the one that's going to be responsible for the whole building of the Tower in Babel. He's going to be behind all of that. And so it's used of Nimrod being a mighty one in the earth. But once again, a man. In Numbers chapter 16, verse 2, it says, and they rose up before Moses. Who was this? This was men. They rose up before Moses with certain of the children of Israel, 250 princes of the assembly, famous in the congregation, and the exact same phrase that we had in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, men of renown. The exact same phrase is used there. And so we read in the context, because context is everything, that this was Korah and his sons, and they're going to rise up against Moses. Now, when the passage says, in many other passages it's the same way, when someone rises up against Moses, that's really the biblical way of saying they rise up against the Torah, because that's what Moses represents. He represents the Torah. That's why the Torah is generally, not always, associated with Moses. The law of Moses, speaking of the Torah. All those things given by God that were expressed through Moses. And so they were rising up against the Torah when they did it. And of course, you know that just like Psalm chapter 82, verses 1 through 6 again, even though these men of renown, which are directly joined at the hip with the mighty ones and the sons of God, if you will, sons of the mighty ones, in Genesis chapter 6, that in the end, they're going to perish. They're going to be taken out. Why? Psalm chapter 82, once again, because you did what you did, you're going to die like men. And so the earth opens up and swallows up Korah and his sons, because when they stood against Moses, they were standing against the commandments of God. That's what they were saying. 2 Samuel 1, verse 19, continuing on with mighty men, it says, the beauty of Israel is slain upon high places. How are the mighty fallen? And once again, the context here is human beings. And notice Gibor in the same context as fallen, Nephal, Nephilim. Any one of those words is used. This is going to be complete. This is going to be replete throughout Scripture. Once again, to me, if something's from God, and it's important, and it's true, it will be everywhere, not just in the pages of your Bible, but revealed in the birds and the bees and the flowers and the trees. Next time when we're together, we're going to continue to study the mighty men and the men of renown. In the meantime, never forget, God is smarter than we are. See you next time. Shalom.
Want more Brad Scott? Get his 3-part teaching, Paul, False Apostle or Falsely Accused, now on DVD at HebraicRootsNetwork.com.